Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. A few weeks ago I made a video defining and defending the use of tropes in storytelling, since tropes are necessary building blocks for creating any sort of story. So to follow up on that, I figured I'd make a video about some of the common fantasy tropes that I enjoy no matter how often they're used, and eventually I'll probably make a video about the ones that I dislike. Now you may be wondering how I chose my list of common tropes, and the answer is pretty randomly. I'm partially pulling from my own reading experiences and also some random Googling, so this certainly isn't going to be an exhaustive list of all common tropes, just the ones that resonate with me. So let's dive into this with the two that I think will be the most contentious. First up is the Chosen One, arguably the most common trope in fantasy. The Chosen One is a person who has been selected by something, fate, a wizard, the antagonist, whatever, to usually save the world in some capacity. A big reason Chosen Ones are maligned is because there was a time where they all followed the same formula. A teenage farm boy learns he has some magical powers that makes him uniquely qualified to defeat the great evil. Usually he would also find out at some point that he's the secret heir to a kingdom, and by the end of the story he gets crowned as the good king that everyone loves. The Chosen One is rooted in Greek stories and their precursors even, where the hero might be blessed by the gods or be a full-on demigod. The Arthurian legend is also a cornerstone of this trope, as King Arthur started off as essentially a nobody and rose to become a king. Some popular Chosen Ones are Randall Thor, Paul Atreides, and Harry Potter, but if you've read their respective stories, you'll see that their circumstances of being the Chosen One are actually different. Mild spoilers for Wheel of Time Dune and Harry Potter. In Wheel of Time, Rand is the reincarnation of a powerful channeler from the past, Lews Therin, who is also called the Dragon, and he has no choice but to lead the fight against the Dark One. In Dune, Paul is the product of millennia of meticulous breeding by the Bene Gesserit, and he's actually not really the real Chosen One that the Bene Gesserit were looking for. His son is. Harry was a victim of circumstance and became a Chosen One due to Voldemort's own foolish actions. So if you're like me and you do like a Chosen One story, you can see that even from popular examples, there are ways to make the Chosen One a different thing from what's considered the norm. And heck, an easy way is to make it a girl instead of a boy. Before I move on, I want to note that I occasionally see characters labeled as Chosen Ones who don't deserve to be. The two primary examples I've seen are Frodo Baggins, which kind of makes sense, and Katniss Everdeen, which makes no sense. And I would argue that these two are not Chosen Ones because they volunteer for their role in the story. Frodo and Katniss are both regular people who rose to the occasion in their respective worlds, which is technically a separate trope than the Chosen One. Next up, my other contentious one, the Dark Lord. The big bad evil who desires nothing more than the destruction of all that's good and wonderful. Dark Lords and ladies have fallen out of favor a bit as audiences started wanting more depth from their antagonists. A villain who wants to cause random wanton destruction tends to not be as interesting as one who has a more relatable motive, plus the idea that everyone is the hero of their own story started to take off more, which fueled the desire for more nuanced villains. So this might not surprise anybody, but I kind of disagree with that statement, and the reason I still like this trope is because it's more realistic than people give it credit for. There are people in real life who choose to cause harm for no deeper reason than they felt like it. Sometimes people's motivations really aren't all that deep, so I still like a Dark Lord who's just unrepentantly evil because at least they're upfront about their motives. Moving on, heroic characters. The protagonist and their companions are good people through and through, and we can count on them to make decisions with the best interests of others at heart. Personally, I like characters who are uncompromisingly good. I know in Avatar: The Last Airbender, some responses to the ending were negative because Aang found a way to save Ozai, and actually the whole lion turtle thing with the energy bending was a lot more contentious than I realized back when the show first started. But I like characters who stand by their values. I like that Aang wanted to find a way to keep Ozai alive and not just flat out kill him. I like a main character who is kind, who wants to help others no matter the cost. This doesn't mean the character is infallible. Even if you're trying to do the right thing, you can still screw up. But I like characters who err on the selfless side rather than the selfish. Mentor figures. We've all had teachers and mentors in our lives, which makes this trope one of the most realistic you'll find in fantasy. Now, our real life mentors usually aren't going to be an old wizard who taps us to go on a quest, but we've all made connections with someone wiser and more experienced than us in some capacity who's pushed us and helped us grow. Pulling from the previous story examples, some popular mentors in fantasy are Gandalf, Moraine, Dumbledore, all of whom fit the wise wizard character archetype. Once again, this pulls from the hero's journey structure, in which a mentor figure meets the hero and convinces them to go on the journey. I never get tired of mentors because they give us a glimpse of what the hero can aspire to be. When magic is involved, it also functions as a point of reference for how the powers work and how strong someone can become. Mentor figures are also a great way to build stakes in a story. All three of the aforementioned mentors die at some point in their respective stories, though two of them do come back. Ripping away someone who has become a vital part of the hero's life is a great emotional dagger to twist, and if the mentor figure does come back to life, it's okay. We get a nice cathartic reunion. union, found family, and firm friendships. This is not exclusive to fantasy, of course, but it often comes about when we've got a main party of characters who either forge new bonds or strengthen existing ones over the course of the story. I like when I can count on characters to have each other's backs no matter what happens. I don't like when characters have been friends for 95% of the story, only to have one of them betray the other one just because it adds drama. One of my favorite recent examples of this trope is the Rage of Dragons and its sequel. Initially, Tao feels like it's basically just him against the world, which is only fueled by him not feeling like he fits in with his training group. But as the story goes on, his emotional barriers are lowered, and he and the rest of the core cast become firmly bonded together. Speaking of Rage of Dragons, another trope I really like is training sequences. Again, not exclusive to fantasy, but the ones in fantasy will usually revolve around either weapons or magic, or sometimes both. In Rage of Dragons, there are realistically two training stories happening simultaneously. The first is in the real world of the story, with Scale Jayed learning to be the best warriors that Lessers can be, and the second is in the underworld of the story, as Tao fights demons and is killed over and over every night, all to definitively become the greatest warrior the Omehi have ever known. Training sequences are fun because they're good vehicles for character interactions that involve action that isn't going to be too high of stakes, usually. The action serves to pull us into the scene, and then the characters' emotions and their connections become the interesting part that pulls us through. It's also a great way to explain a magic system that has rules. In Mistborn, Vin trains with the different types of allomancy, with different members of the thieving crew, and we get to learn alongside her how each of these powers function. Now for possibly the best fantasy trope of all, dragons. I'm willing to bet that a lot of people do think of dragons when they hear the word fantasy, and that's because dragons are just awesome. I think part of what makes dragons really cool is their size and ferocity. Whether they're being depicted as a savage animal or like a really wise being, dragons are typically capable of crazy amounts of destruction. They fly and breathe fire, they have natural armor, and conquering one is usually a huge feat in any story. I unabashedly love dragons, and I think any story immediately becomes elevated by their presence. The next one, which this list would be totally incomplete without, is magic, because it's a huge part of fantasy and probably is next to dragons as far as the most popular. A huge swath of fantasy stories include some kind of magic. That's what we expect from fantasy. It might be something as small as the ability to change hair color, or it might be something as huge and fleshed out like the one power in the Wheel of Time. In any event, magic is always fun, especially when it feels actually necessary to the setting and the plot unfolding and isn't just there for flavor. Hard magic systems have grown a lot more popular over the past 15 years or so, and Sanderson has had an undeniable influence on that, but a soft magic system done well can still be really compelling. More than anything, magic evokes a sense of wonder, and that's really what I expect the most out of a fantasy story. I want to be wowed. Next up, Ancient Ruins. Thousands of years ago, the ultra-magical and super advanced city of blah 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 was destroyed in an unknown cataclysm. The only thing that remains of their once powerful empire are ruins dotting the land. How convenient. I think Ancient Ruins are really neat because if you have a setting where human civilization has been going on for thousands of years, then you're going to have ruins. We have ruins buried underground in the real world after all, so why wouldn't it happen in a fantasy world? Bonus points, of course, if the ruins house magical artifacts that people are scrambling to get their hands on. Side note, I would actually really love to read something that's akin to Indiana Jones, but set in a more classical fantasy world. I think that'd be really cool. Next up on my list actually is magical artifacts, or MacGuffins, depending on how they're used. This is a good follow-up to the Ancient Ruins trope because magical artifacts tend to be very old and can't be reproduced in the present day of the story, hence why they're so valuable. And sometimes discovering how to actually recreate these items is part of the story. The One Ring is arguably the most famous example of this trope, both as a magical artifact and a MacGuffin. It works as a MacGuffin because it's innocuous on its own, but it actually contains incredible power. It's also the focal point of the story as Sauron needs it to regain his full power. So plot relevance is what typically moves a standard magical artifact into a MacGuffin, especially in its relation to the villain. An ancient magic sword that shoots fireballs is really cool, don't get me wrong, but if the villain also needs the sword to complete his goals, then it becomes a MacGuffin. But magical artifacts are always really cool, and usually swords are the coolest of those things. Lastly, the pseudo-medieval setting, typically Europe, more specifically Britain. Another trope that's been popularized by Tolkien, this one is starting to wane and give way to settings that are analogous to other parts of the world and different time periods. And of course that's an overwhelmingly good thing because it allows readers to learn more about non-British regions and better displays the diversity of written works in the world. I know for me in recent years, I've become really interested in flintlock fantasy and settings that are analogous to the Industrial Revolution, especially when magic is involved because I like seeing that clash of new technology versus old magic. But I also still love the quasi-medieval setting. It's fun, it's familiar, and it's a good landing place if you're someone who doesn't want to worry about firearms in your fantasy. Yes, I know there was overlap between firearms and medieval, that's why I said quasi-medieval. And this may be total conjecture, but I think American authors specifically who tend to latch on to the sort of medieval Europe setting is because we don't really have our own medieval history to draw from. After all, I can't exactly take inspiration from an era of American history post-founding of the USA that doesn't involve firearms of some kind. And now a bonus one that I saw listed as a trope, but I once again completely disagree with the labeling of, is the quest. This actually should not be roped into the tropes because it's a type of plot structure. In fact, it's one of the 7 basic plot archetypes. Calling a quest a trope is like calling a protagonist a trope. But since I love a good quest story, I figured I'd tack it on here at the end. So there you have it, my short list of common fantasy tropes that I enjoy. Stay tuned for whenever I get around to making the list of the ones I don't enjoy. As always, thanks for stopping by my channel. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in hearing more of my thoughts on various stories and updates from my own writing journey. Leave a comment below if you've got any thoughts about this list of tropes, or if you have any common tropes that you enjoy, or feel free to just say hello. I post new videos on Sundays. Until next time, I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you here in the next video.